On the 10th of October 2024, a summit was held in Asmara, which is the capital city of Eritrea, right? In this summit, a number of regional issues were to be discussed. These issues included the war which is currently happening in Sudan, the attacks on commercial ships and vessels, particularly in the Red Sea. They were also to discuss the regional threat which comes in the form of the Islamic extremist group known as Al-Shabaab, which is positioned or stationed in Somalia, and they were to discuss the various tensions which have occurred recently or developed recently in the Horn of Africa. Now, in this summit, particularly, there were three main countries in attendance. The first country is the host country, Eritrea. The second country in attendance was Egypt. And the third country which attended the summit was Somalia. Now, this summit was very odd because in this summit, right, a major powerhouse in the Horn of Africa didn't attend, or rather was not invited to the summit. This powerhouse is basically Ethiopia. Now, one might wonder why exactly is Ethiopia not in this summit, which particularly was focusing on discussing issues of the Horn of Africa, right? And there are reports which have been released that the reason why Ethiopia was not invited into the summit was the fact that the three countries that have been mentioned, which is Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia, were basically forming an anti-Ethiopian axis. Now, when we look deep into the attendees of this summit, which occurred in Asmara, you would understand that each of these countries, these three countries which attended, had their own issues with Ethiopia. For example, when it comes to Egypt, there are tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia in regards to the GERD project, which is being built on the Blue Nile, right? Now, the GERD project is basically stands for um, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right? And it is being built on the Blue Nile, right? Which contributes about 90% of water to the Nile, right? Now, the tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia are based on the fact that this dam being built on the Blue Nile, right, will basically uh, limit the water which ends up in Egypt through the Nile River, right? So Egypt and Ethiopia are having tensions over this dam, which Ethiopia is basically building. The tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia were so heightened, particularly under the Trump administration, that Egypt was threatening to blow up this dam, right? Now, the fears that Egypt has in regards to this great Ethiopian Renaissance dam is that Ethiopia, right? If they would have tensions with Egypt, Ethiopia would actually stop the flow of water towards the Nile, which flows and runs through Egypt, right? And this would be a total devastation of the Egyptian economy and the basic livelihoods of the Egyptian people. Now, when we look at the second country in attendance in this summit, it's basically Eritrea, right? Eritrea was a former federal state under Ethiopia, but a war occurred in the late 90s and Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia, forming its own independent nation, basically cutting off Ethiopia from the Red Sea and making Ethiopia basically a landlocked a landlocked country. Now, tensions further increased, right, between Eritrea and Ethiopia during the Tigray War, when it is believed that Eritrea was busy supplying arms to the Eritrean people, which was fighting the central government in Addis Ababa, right? Now, when the president of Ethiopia came into office, he advocated for peace between Eritrea and um, and Ethiopia, right? But when the Tigray War happened, he actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for advocating peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia, right? But when the Tigray War actually happened, the tensions broke down again between Eritrea and Ethiopia. That's when Ethiopia was starting to posture itself, saying that they need access to a coastline, particularly in the Red Sea, right? And this actually meant taking over Eritrea and defeating it and absorbing it into the federal states in Ethiopia again. And number three is Somalia, right? Now, the tensions between Somalia and and Ethiopia particularly occurred in the early parts of 2024, particularly in January, right? When Ethiopia signed a memorandum of understanding with Somaliland, right, for Ethiopia to access a coastline so that they can be able to build a naval force, right? And particularly have commercial access to international markets through a coastline that is found in Somaliland. Now, this move by Ethiopia really angered Somalia, right? Because Somaliland, right, is basically operated as an independent state, even though it's not recognized by the international community, right? So, this is one of the tensions which exist between Somalia and Ethiopia. Another tension which exists between Somalia and Ethiopia is that Ethiopia had smuggled weapons into a northern east state or region in Somalia known as the it's basically known as Puntland, right? So these are the tensions which exist between Somalia and Ethiopia. Now, a number of other things occurred between Ethiopia and Somalia, particularly Somalia uh, accepted military aid, right, which was shipped by Egypt, right, bringing them arms, particularly to fight Al Shabaab. And Somalia wants to now replace the Ethiopian soldiers which are there as peacekeepers under the guise of the African Union, right, to assist them with Al Shabaab. So these tensions, particularly in the Horn of Africa, right, occurred because it seems as if Ethiopia is the central issue amongst all of these attendees in this summit. Now, this is why it's dubbed a anti-Ethiopian axis summit, right? Because of the things that I've just mentioned. In this summit, the three countries mentioned, which are Egypt, Somalia, and Eritrea, basically agreed to increase and strengthen ties, right, in regards to the politics, the economy, and security issues which were being discussed in the summit.